Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. Today's episode, I have Mr. Kareem Puranda, who is a licensed professional counselor, licensed clinical addiction specialist, and a certified clinical trauma professional. He is also the owner of Self-Talk Counseling and Consulting. He specializes in providing holistic and multiculturally sensitive approaches and working with law enforcement colleagues and professionals. So he has a vast amount of experiences. And today's episode is really, truly special for me because, first of all, Kareem is the first Black male that I've had on my podcast. And that's truly special in and of itself because I have really tried hard to get men on the show, especially a Black man, and it is very difficult to get them on the show and to talk and open up and be vulnerable when it comes to mental health. And so I really am applauding Kareem for being the first one up here to talk about be open and be vulnerable and talk about his experiences and his struggles with being a law enforcement officer. He also discusses, how there's a blurred line between protecting and serving and taking the law into your own hands because as law enforcement professionals, people learn to normalize stress in hostile environments, and therefore they adapt their behavior to that environment. So he talks a lot about that, and he shares his own personal experience, which I think you guys are going to love it. So here we go. Okay. Hi, Kareem. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you're on the show. I'm excited about this interview. You and I connected via Facebook. A lot of great energy there. We actually have a lot in common. So I without further ado, tell us about you and what you're doing.
No doubt. Thank you. First of all, thank you and your listening audience for this opportunity. My name is Kareem Puranda, as you mentioned earlier, and I'm a native of Bronx, New York. Came down south on a football scholarship to play ball. Ended up staying down here, fell in love with the atmosphere, the down south cooking, the down south vibe and everything, and became a transplant. I'm a Southerner now. I still claim New York at the heart, but hey, I'm down south. It's not where you from, it's where you at type of thing.
That's right.
I'm a licensed professional counselor. I'm a clinical addiction specialist, and I also have a certification in treating trauma. I'm also an author. I just published a book, self-published last year in November, a book titled Breaking the Code of Silence, A Cop's Journey to Triumph and Truth. I have a law enforcement background, and there's a lot of I'm motivated to do this line of work that I'm currently in to, in fact, help police officers manage the stress that they're contending with in their current profession. Law enforcement is a highly stressful industry, and I don't think enough is being done to help officers develop self-care habits that would be advantageous or beneficial to the longevity of their lives, not just their careers, but their lives. And so what I've done is I entered into this field with a passion, not only to help the community, but to specifically help law enforcement officers and other first responders, manage stress.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what's your background in law enforcement? What kind of officer were you?
So I worked at the Salisbury Police Department for 8 years. I've done a number of duties ranging from It's a small department, so you have the ability to work in various areas of the department. So I was a detective for about a year and a half. I was
Okay.
on a SWAT team. I was a school resource officer. I was a regular patrol officer. Even participated in the recruiting for a little stint. So I was able to see different layers or different components of the agency,
Okay.
and just to educate myself on what that would look like if I were, in fact, to become a chief one day. I want to know how all parts of my agency worked.
Okay. And so you went from law enforcement to becoming a counselor.
Yes.
What influenced that transition? And
It's a
from a
long story.
ball player, it sounds like you were a pro ball player at one point, and then you went from that to this and to that.
Yeah, I never made it pro. I was actually just collegiate
Okay,
ball
good.
player, and
Okay.
graduated and went straight into law enforcement. So my story is quite interesting. You know, I utilized the book as a case study on my life and talk about some of the challenges I experienced as an African American police officer. And there were things during my time as a police officer that I wasn't aware of that manifested later on in my maturity, I would say, as a result of adversities. In law enforcement, I separated from law enforcement because of burnout. I can say that it was because of burnout. Back then, I didn't know the makeup or the criterias or the nature of burnout until I got out of the profession. And what happened was I was experiencing lawsuits for using excessive force, and inevitably, what happened about 2 years after I left the profession, indictment charges were brought against me for using excessive force under the color of law. Some cases that the state and the federal government were investigating, and as a result, I had to go to a 4-day trial. Went through the whole process of
Mhm.
being booked and placed in a jail cell before my first appearance, and it was an experience that I had never been through before. And it was just the irony of it all forced me to do an introspective check of myself and assess how did I get here, because I didn't enter the profession of law enforcement the way that I exited, and it caused me to do an investigation. And it's the premise of why I wrote the book. And the book, again, like I said, it's a case study of my life that gave me permission to be therapeutic. It allowed me to be therapeutic with my process of telling my story, because for so long I was silent about challenges I was facing when I was in law enforcement.
Okay. And I want to back up a little bit because, and maybe, it's up to your comfort level how much you're
Sure.
willing to share about your story. But since the book is based on that, and we're primarily talking about that, I'm just going to ask questions and you tell me what you feel comfortable answering.
Sure thing.
But can you talk a little bit more about the excessive force and what was happening with you in excessive force? And I'm asking this because I do think it's important, because you have some very interesting theories in your book about the progression of law enforcement and how your exposure to certain things can actually turn into personality disorders.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
So, in order for me to lay it out for you, I have to go back into my childhood.
Okay.
So, growing up, I grew up in a single parent household, and one of the first experiences I had with challenges was abandonment. And I wasn't raised by my dad, or I know my dad, but I wasn't raised physically by him, and that created a lot of challenges for me psychologically, in
Can
terms
you
of
tell me about
self-esteem. Yeah, absolutely. Self-esteem, not feeling valued, feeling low worth, and things of that nature.
that? Mhm.
Because, hey, where's my dad? My dad isn't around. And I would say that things took a turn during fifth grade. There was a big transition that occurred in my life in fifth grade, where I was attending Catholic school from kindergarten all the way up to fourth grade, and my mom was footing the bill, and she could no longer afford that. So I had to go to transition to public school. And let me tell you, that transition was hell, because I went from wearing a uniform 5 days a week, no problem there, to now having to wear regular clothes. Now, the thing about it is that we didn't come from money. And so I had a lot of secondhand clothes. It was just my mother trying to afford what she could, and I would get picked on. And there was one incident that I think sort of took it to the top, where I was eating lunch one day. I talk about this in my book because I remember it very vividly. I was eating a hamburger, put some ketchup on it and whatnot. I was eating a hamburger, not paying attention. Ketchup dropped onto my pants. And so what happened was I had 2 pairs of pants during that time of my life, and I rotated them. I don't know if anybody knows about rotating clothes, but you rotate your clothes and so that it doesn't look like you're wearing the same thing over and over again. And I attempted to do that earlier in the week when this ketchup splashed onto my pants leg. And I attempted to wipe it out and wash it out the best that I could. And I didn't want to let my mom know about it because we only wash clothes once a week at the end of the week. And because in New York, you got to go to the laundromat and all that jazz. But anyway, so I ended up wearing the same pants back to school. Let's say that happened on a Tuesday, I think. I wore the same pants back to school on maybe Thursday or Friday. And one of the other kids took notice of it and started making fun of me, saying that I wear my clothes, I'm a bum and I'm poor and I'm homeless and all this other jazz. And it drew attention from other students who were also chiming in and jumping in on the joke for them. But for me, it was traumatizing because there was nothing I could do about his statement because it was the truth. I didn't have any clothes like they did. And so I was forced to wear clothes that, weren't perhaps the first pick, if you will, and it psychologically traumatized me. So 5th grade was a terrible year for me. And what happened was my perspective on life changed. I became I didn't trust people. I became angry. And 5th, 6th grade, 7th grade, all throughout my middle school career, I was getting suspended, fighting like crazy, terrible grades. And this happened all the way up to high school as well, until I found football. And then football was like my stress reliever. I was able to offload a lot of my pain and my anger and my challenges, my psychological challenges off on the field. And I didn't have the emotional vocabulary to talk about what was really bothering me. And at the root of it all was the fact that my dad wasn't there to teach me how to fight or defend myself or to understand what manhood meant and all these different things. I had to learn it through trial and error or from people in the streets who really didn't care much about my life 10, 15 years from that particular point. They were just people who were hurt like me, giving me information that was their best information according to their hurt and wasn't really beneficial. So I ended up doing a lot of things that were deemed undesirable. And growing up, I say growing up in the streets, I wasn't really raised in the streets, but I learned a lot of street behavior hanging around different people. And it's that sort of exposure that set the foundation for how I patrolled as a police officer. In my old neighborhood, it was the idea of no one disrespects you. If people disrespect you, you got to give them the business. You get into a fight or you beat them up, whatever it may be. And you had to make sure that people respected you. That was like at the top of the list. And when I became a police officer, what influenced me to become a police officer was during my senior year in college. I had a professor, an African-American professor, who was also the first chief of police at that particular agency, who invited me to become a police officer. Now, I had matured somewhat, but I still had laid dormant some of these behaviors that were never triggered while I was in college. So, no one ever disrespected me in college. It wasn't a big deal. So when you don't use a skill, you don't think that it's still there, perhaps, is what I was under the impression. So I get into law enforcement and I go through the academy and all that jazz, and I pass and I qualified and I'm hired, and they put me to work in a neighborhood very similar to mine. Low income, a lot of crime, violent crimes and things of that nature. A lot of folks that look like us. And the first thing I get met with is disrespect. People don't like me, not because of who I am, but because of my uniform.
Yeah.
But back then, I didn't know how to disassociate the two. And so for me, coming into law enforcement under the culture of law enforcement where, we're the good guys and everybody else is the bad guys, we got to win. We got to go home at the end of the day. It's one of those things where ego becomes a very, very big deal as it relates to how one patrols and how one, in fact, affects the way that they perform their functions within the law enforcement profession. Mm-hmm. Not all police officers, but those who are not aware of the psychological challenges that they're carrying around with them.
Good. And Okay. And so what's going on with everything that happened from then on up until the um the stuff that you got in trouble for? Because as I understand it, they put you in this neighborhood and you had this attitude or this perception of, you don't allow people to disrespect you. Um, in my experience in working with law enforcement and even in corrections, I also feel like that's just not a one man type of thing. I feel like that's a culture there within that profession. Do you feel like um, maybe during your work there that was influenced by the profession as well?
No question. When I graduated BLET training, which is basic law enforcement training down here in the South, uh, I entered into field training, and the first thing that the FTO tells me is that forget everything you learned while you were in BLET. There's a different way that you patrol, and it's not according to that book science that they give you in BLET. So there you have two different distinctions on how to, in fact, do the job. And each field training officer that I had different perspectives on how to patrol, and their perspectives stem from their personal experiences and their professional experiences. And as a rookie, you don't know any better other than to take the tutelage that these individuals are giving you,
Yes.
because you do want to get a good grade or a good review on their assessment as it relates to whether or not they approve you to be released on your own. And so you just do what they tell you to do. And it's really it's sort of paramilitary in the sense that you do as you're told and don't ask any questions. So it was somewhat like that. And in that process, the rookie sort of becomes a sponge, and you just learn from what these different guys do and how they do it, and then you tailor it to fit your style. And at the end of the day, two things were emphasized: this theory that you must go home the same way you came in, and it's better to be tried by better to be tried by 12 than carried by 6.
Okay.
And so it's
What
the
is
idea of going.
What does that mean? Can you tell us what those things mean for people who don't know?
Certainly, it's the idea of being able to go home the same way you came in, and that means by any means necessary, because we live in a world where the adversary is everywhere. She could be anywhere, and you have to be vigilant. You have to be ready for it. And at the end of the day, you need to win, and the bad guy suffers the consequence. That's pretty much the bottom line of what it is.
Okay, and so taking a step back, you and I had spoken a little bit earlier when we talked on the phone. You had this concept of how you normalize stress from the environment that you grew up in, and then you carried that with you to law enforcement. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think this should be true for most environments where there's a high level of poverty, a high level of challenges with security and safety. When you grow up in an environment where you see people dead, or you see people get shot or stabbed up, or you see a lot of violence, you become desensitized to that type of activity or that engagement. It's normalized. It's nothing to see. So I've seen dead bodies in the street laid out before EMS arrived and police showed up, from people getting shot and stuff as a young child. And you grow up seeing that on a repetitive basis. It's nothing. When I became a police officer, I saw dead bodies. It didn't bother me, right? At least so I thought. I think we people in those communities tend to package those types of trauma in a way as it being normal so they can cope with it and get through it, not realizing that outside of the box, this is totally abnormal.
Yeah.
So what may be normal to some in these challenging neighborhoods is so not normal to folks who are in the quote unquote normal world, if you will. And this is where I think the perspectives get twisted, right? And the misunderstandings occur because many people don't understand the experiences and the engagement that created the psychological perspectives that we see many of our young folks dealing with today who come from neighborhoods like that.
And it's very interesting that you bring that up. And I don't know how much you know about theories or how much you hold on to theories, but one of the theories that I researched and used in my dissertation study was the subculture of violence theory by Wolfgang and Ferracuti.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my chair people didn't like it because it was a theory that was developed by two white researchers who went into an inner city neighborhood. I believe it was in Philadelphia somewhere, where it was riddled with violence and criminal activities. And it was a lower class neighborhood. And basically what they said with that theory is exactly what you're saying, that you learn violence, or you take on these things and you learn that as a way of life. It's a way
Right.
to survive. And so you become a product of your environment, and not to glamorize, they got a lot of flack for that because they're white guys going into a black neighborhood. And so people are like, oh, you're just saying all this stuff. But I do think that there's something to what you're saying, and it doesn't even have to be a black or white issue. It could just be, if you grow up around violence, on some level you become desensitized to it, and then there's some people that do begin to use this as just a way of life, like it's nothing.
Yeah, I consider it human adaptation, because me, I wasn't a tough guy. I became a tough guy out of the necessity to survive, to be safe. I wasn't going to have, at my young age, back in sixth grade, middle school, I wasn't going to have anybody else make fun of me the way that they did in fifth grade again. And anybody who had something to say, I was going to bust it. I was going to bust them up real good. And so I became this tough guy, or I practiced it in as a measure of safety, not because I wanted to be tough. And I think a lot of the children, or the young men in some of these neighborhoods, are in fact the same way. They're not really built to be tough, but they practice tough because it keeps them safe. It's the same thing with sagging pants and having this dress code associated or synonymous with the hood. If you look like what the videos portray that garner a level of respect, then you also will be respected because you match that particular dress code that other people can identify with.
Yeah.
And so it's not necessarily that people want to be bad, but it's like in some of these neighborhoods, I've got to be this way so that I don't become the prey amongst all these predators. I used to have gold fronts and cornrows and all that jazz.
Oh,
and
wow.
a lot of that stuff was associated with wanting to feel safe.
Yeah.
And I had the outfit, the army fatigues and the Timberland boots on a regular, baggy jeans. That was the dress code. We saw that in the videos, and that's what we mimicked. That's what we modeled. And as a result, if you could follow that stuff to a T, you remain safe.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I see with a lot of the guys that I work with in corrections. They adapt that modality that, hey, this is my way to survive. This is,
Yeah.
I can't be, essentially punked,
Right.
I've got to make an example so that everybody else is going to know. And so I think I have to agree with what you were saying. And so continue to walk me through what else was going on with you while you were in law enforcement.
Right. So I believe, right, without really totally fully understanding it at the time, that I was suffering from PTSD without even knowing it, right? Because there were certain behaviors that would set me off. I would get triggered very easily.
Such
And like, definitely if somebody said something slick out the mouth, that would trigger me because that was something that I practiced in my old neighborhood. Anybody that talked junk or had mad lip service, you busted their lip and then they wouldn't talk no more. So it was that kind of stuff. But again, it never manifested until it was triggered by someone's disrespect or whatever I internalized as disrespect. The ideology of so I was always under a state of, even in the neighborhood I grew up in, it's the idea of being in a state of hypervigilance. You're always looking over your shoulder. You're always scheming and looking at people who going to try to rob you or who want to try to sneak up on you. So you always have a sense of hypervigilance, right? And that's the same type of hypervigilance they teach you to have while you're in law enforcement, because the suspect who will be unassuming may try to ambush you. So you always have to remain on high alert.
Yes.
I had that. I grew up with that. I practiced that. So it was very natural for me to transition into law enforcement because I had a lot of the qualities that law enforcement officers use to stay alive, right? Heck, I stayed alive in my hood. Some of my friends died. Some of them didn't grow up to see 20. And heck, I'm one of the rarities. And I got a couple other great friends that I grew up with that are still doing great things with their lives in New York. But, you know, I left New York, which was a blessing for me because I don't know what I would have been doing had I stayed. But in any event, going to BLET, they teach you how to be hypervigilant with these videos, shoot or don't shoot videos, or videos that sensationalize officers losing their lives while in the line of duty,
Yes.
because an officer lowered their guard, or they weren't paying attention, they weren't hypervigilant, and as a result, the officer was shot and killed.
Yes.
And the suspect lived, or may have gotten shot in a shootout with the police afterwards.
We watched the same videos.
These are the things that they say, hey, don't let this be you, and make sure that you go home at the end of the day. And so when you watch these videos, for me as an officer, it made me feel a sense of anger that this suspect got away with killing a good guy, someone who was trying to do their job and wasn't expecting this guy to take their life because of whatever criminal act or mischief that they were trying to conceal. They took an officer's life, and I said, you know what, that's not going to be me. It ain't going to happen to me. So this is how it happens. So they train you, right? They don't train you according to race or anything like that. It's according to behaviors. Behaviors is the key. So BLET conditions the officer's mind that a person who's non-compliant, a person who flees and runs, a person who possesses guns and drugs, a person who does anything that the officer tells them not to do, or goes against the officer's instruction, they are considered a threat, right? And any type of, if I give you clear commands to do something and you disobey them, you are now sending my stress levels to the roof because you're not complying with a reasonable request, and I have reason to believe that you're going to be a threat or a danger to me. That's what happened in those videos. When the officer says, hey, show me your hands, they didn't show hands. Next thing you know, they have a gun. What do you do? It's a split-second decision. Officers have to respond according to their best judgment, according to how they interpret or perceive the threat. Now, an officer may come up to me and tell me, hey, you know, who are you, whatever you may be, and I go to get my wallet and I reach for my back pocket or my side pocket. That officer might be inclined to shoot me because it looks like I'm reaching for a gun. This is what people who go for a gun do. This is the movement, but I may be going for my wallet. So in that officer's mind, you know what? The movement, the behavior is what I was addressing, not necessarily the current reality. And this is where it gets twisted. Officers, we were trained in that state of hypervigilance. Neurobiology tells you that when you are in a fight, flight, freeze, and this is the training that's occurring, fight, flight, freeze, you don't rationally think or calculate what's going on at the particular moment. You only know impulsively to respond to a default behavior that you've been conditioned to do. And in the BLET training, it is double tap to the midsection, the area where there's most mass, so that you can stop the threat. And that's what happens. And in that state of hypervigilance or that state of fear, whatever, you hear this, I was in fear of my life. That officer took action according to the impulsive behaviors that are taught in BLET, when in fact, the person may not have been a threat, but he was responding, or she was responding to the behaviors that the suspect exhibited. And so you have a lot of use of force. A lot of the use of forces I was engaged in were associated with subjects resisting, obstructing, or delaying my attempt to arrest them or to do something as it relates to criminal enforcement. And it's typically, most of the folks that I've used force against were people who were in possession of drugs of some sort, didn't want to be apprehended. There were a couple people who did have guns, and or people who fled the scene, and then they want to get into a fight once they get caught. And so a lot of my use of force is, you know, I took martial arts, and you know, I was heavy-handed. I was heavy-handed before I got in law enforcement. I was heavy-handed in the game, and a lot of it, again, I believe were triggers associated with my youth and my past. And law enforcement just gave me conditions or opportunities where people resisted arrest to do what I've always done from way back when.
And that's very interesting. And you know, I see that a lot in the work that I've done with people being heavy-handed and, you know, treating people a certain way and doing what they're conditioned to do, and then kind of giving each other accolades for it.
Yeah.
You know, kind of like, hey, they high five, bro.
Correct.
That,
Correct.
you know, and then, you know, watching those glorified videos. And me personally, I kind of hate those trainings because we got to go through it in corrections as well. And I hate them because I feel like it's a glorified time to basically watch them kick inmates or shoot inmates or do whatever they have to do to protect, or what they feel like they have to do, but it's also glorified violence.
Right, right. And again, it's the idea that this profession is it's either us or them. And obviously, you're trained to win the fight, whatever the fight may be, because there are some elements in society, people who are struggling with mental health disorders that are not quite understood by law enforcement personnel, and they're willing to hurt others because of the hurt they're dealing with or whatever it may be. And these are people that law enforcement officers are on the front lines with addressing because no one else wants to address them. You think about these mass shootings that have occurred recently over the course of this year, even like the latter part of last year. It's not an easy job, and it takes a special person to do this line of work, law enforcement. But it's also a delicate balance of perceptually what's the right way to do it. And that's a difficult debate for anybody to really put out there and talk about.
So when did you feel like things went too far for you?
When the cell phone video caught me punching a guy at a club, and that's what kickstarted all of this. And I was arresting him for an earlier incident where he took a swing on me when I was attempting to arrest his brother, which I didn't know at the time. This was during a party of some sort, a club event where I was doing extra duty as an off-duty police officer. And the incident was filmed. And I think that's when the epiphany hit me that something was wrong. It wasn't just me doing my job. It was something else there that needed to be addressed. So to be very honest with you, I believe that incident was a blessing in disguise as it relates to helping me develop a higher level of consciousness and awareness about some stuff that I was dealing with that I didn't know I was dealing with for the majority of my life up until that point. So I would say it hit me because if that didn't occur, if I wasn't recorded, I'd probably still be a police officer. I probably would have been a chief by now. And I don't know how my brain, I don't know what kind of condition my psychological standing would have been in. Or heck, I might have been one of those officers who was involved in a shooting. I don't know. But I think that was, for me, at the time in my life, it was a blessing in disguise because I've learned so much since that time about not only myself, but also the way the brain works and how it evolves over the course of one's human developmental lifespan.
What was it about that incident that made you feel like you went too far? What was it that finally gave you that aha moment that you think?
Back then, it was pure ego, and it was about the idea of wanting to prove a point. During that melee, there was a big melee between apparently two gangs of some sort. I don't know all the specifics of it, but I know that we were called in to clear it out, and it was just nothing but pandemonium and pure mayhem. And as I was attempting to break it up and get people to leave the establishment, people were swinging at me, people were throwing things at me, and I had to defend myself against his brother primarily. And I was attempting to arrest his brother, and then that's when he came over and took a shot at me, and I couldn't arrest him at that point in time because the crowd was still converging, and I had to disengage his brother until security was able to assist me with backing the crowd up, and I was able to now arrest his brother. And then later on in that melee, he was still making statements and things of that nature that I said, hey, you know what? I need to go arrest him. And I, it's like hindsighting it right now. I could have just let him continue to talk, but in my mind, I said, he needs to go to jail for the earlier offense that he did, and now he's talking junk. Now I need to arrest him now since he didn't leave. And that's what I think the ego, which is a big thing as it relates to personality disorders and all that jazz, narcissistic personality disorders, played a big role in how all of that stuff got kickstarted. My ego. So,
as a result of that, can you talk a little bit more about what happened and kind of like, not just necessarily what happened with you in your job, but what was happening with you maybe mentally and emotionally as you were kind of going through this and you're watching all of this stuff unfold in your life and going through all this stress?
Right. That's a great question. I would say that I was led to believe that I was doing everything right. I was led to believe that the way I had matured worked in keeping me safe. It worked in keeping me alive. It worked in allowing me to see the age that I was at that time, something that some of my friends weren't able to do. And so there was no reason to change. And even when I got into the profession, it worked. I was able to go home. I wasn't being carried by six, and it worked. Based upon the neighborhoods I worked in, I was doing an effective job. I was once told by an upper management person that if I'm not getting complaints, that I'm not doing a good job. So I was led to believe that, if I'm going out here and I'm cleaning up the streets, I'm improving the quality of life by removing the drug dealers and removing the guys that make walking the streets unsafe, then I'm doing a good job. And with that comes complaints. Somebody didn't like how I arrested them. Somebody didn't like how I handled them or whatever it may be, but I was doing my job. And so I was led to believe that I was doing a good job. And that the whole ordeal with the incident from the club and how the state and the federal agents were invited in to investigate the case, it made me rethink that, because what I thought was good wasn't. And so that shook my whole world up. It shook my perspective up. It made me challenge everything that I thought was true and reassess it. And so that's why I told you earlier, I feel like that was the most necessary thing that I had to go through in order for me to wake up and look at things from another lens.
So, okay. And I agree. And I tell guys that I work with all the time that, sometimes you need that kick in the butt to learn that big lesson,
No question.
And it sounds like you went through this whole thing where you were kind of shamed. It was widely publicized and you kind of got dragged through the mud.
Yeah.
Your life may have been on the line, so you may have been looking at possibly doing time by doing this trial. What was the outcome of the trial?
Not guilty on 2 accounts, because the thing about those 2 cases that I felt like were unnecessary, where both of these individuals resisted arrest. They ran from a traffic stop, and then they both resisted arrest when they were apprehended.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't understand why I was going to trial for that, but that's what they chose to charge me with. Okay. And I was eventually exonerated of any wrongdoing. Even though I knew I was not guilty the entire time, considering the law and the way we were trained to address people who resist arrest. Again, it put me in a predicament to think like, yo, why did this have to happen to me? And I had to, that's when I looked over my entire life and saw where I was living up a facade. I wasn't being authentic to who I was. And that's what really started my journey on this approach to seeking to change careers towards clinical mental health.
So while you were going through that, were you going through counseling yourself?
No, here's the thing. I was still battling the stigma associated with counseling. And I think I mentioned this in my book. I did mention it in my book. I'm not so sure that my attempt at becoming a counselor was in fact my roundabout way of getting help in understanding my condition. Okay. So it was sort of an expensive therapeutic process, but nonetheless, it put me in a predicament to where now I can help others. But I really do believe that I re-enrolled into school because I already had a master's in public administration with ambitions of becoming a chief one day. But pursuing the master's in clinical mental health counseling, I believe, is what educated me on the self-help that I administered on my process instead of going to a counselor, because I was still sort of embarrassed or concerned about being vulnerable in front of someone I didn't know.
So did you ever get treatment for your PTSD?
I can't say that I have. What I can.
Oh, your volume went out. Okay, there you are. Okay, go ahead and say that. Yeah.
What I can say is that I am aware. I haven't necessarily sat down with a clinician to process any of those things, but I've sort of worked through my own process by becoming aware of how all of these experiences created triggers that caused my behaviors that I exhibited at one stretch and phase of my life. Okay. And so I'm more aware of it today than I was back then.
So if you were to step outside of yourself and talk to yourself in a way, do you think that's the healthiest thing for you?
Reframe that question for me.
Like, if let's say, for example, you're talking to somebody else that's not you, but has a similar situation and went through the same thing that you went through, all of the same stuff. Would you agree with what they're doing, or would you recommend that they still go to counseling anyway?
No, I would definitely advocate getting counseling. I would definitely advocate it, no
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Because there's so much benefit to that relationship that I understand. I'm more trusting today than I was back then.
Yeah.
And so being a living witness and going through the process of getting credentialed to become a professional counselor, and understanding the theories and being able to apply those theories to my life, I'm like, wow, this makes sense. I can see my trajectory or my pathology on how I became what I was, which is what I articulate in my book, just the course of things that led up to how I became this police officer who entered the profession to do a lot of good, but man, I left it in a condition that I did not anticipate.
So it sounds like you just kind of went through this cathartic thing on your own by doing the book and going through everything in terms of your schooling, but you don't necessarily agree that that's the best thing for someone like you. You also think that at some point counseling should be done. Correct,
because everyone is not, I can't speak for everyone as it relates to self-awareness, because again, you only know what you know, and belief is a subjective truth that we all live by. And I work with clients who are mandated clients who are very resistant to the counseling process, because again, it's the idea of their box of understanding. All they know is what they've been exposed to.
Correct.
And anything foreign to that doesn't necessarily help them in the environment that they currently have adopted behaviors to exist, to survive by.
Correct. So let me ask you this, because when you and I had talked before, you had said that you felt like, going through the things that you had been through, especially in law enforcement, that one would develop antisocial personality disorder.
Correct.
Which is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this show. Well, first of all, can you tell my listeners what antisocial personality disorder is and what your theory is behind that development?
Sure. I can summarize it in this way. So we go through some experiences that put us in a place of where we're injured, emotionally injured. And I would say that emotional injury hurts us so bad that we develop coping mechanisms as best as we can to avoid being hurt again. Antisocial personality disorder, among many disorders that people develop, is one that's attributed to, I would classify it as, I'll hurt you before you hurt me. I'd rather stay to myself than be around other people. And my ultimate end game is to make sure that I'm good and I'm not going to let anybody step over bounds into my vulnerable spaces. It's like touching a hot stove. I don't want to get burned again. And so people are guarded immensely. They're very guarded and don't want anybody to get close to them, because people who were close to them hurt them in some way, shape, or form, and therefore they can't trust any longer. And so that antisocial personality disorder, I correlated that police officers could potentially manifest or have this disorder manifest as a result of feeling like the community is always against them. The community that they're working to help constantly gives them the middle finger, or doesn't appreciate the work that they do. And it's almost like, why even bother? And then you have a department that's ran by politics, where people who don't understand the profession or the role of the profession try to dictate how police officers do the job, adds another layer of stress and burnout that sort of thickens the desire to be antisocial and disassociate from the agency, and also disassociate from connecting with the community. And so, I mean, it's so multi-layered and multifaceted as it relates to how one can internalize it if they don't have the proper supports, if you will.
Right. And so there's a disregard for the law or doing what's right with the antisocial personality. And would you say then, based upon what you're saying, that you felt like you had antisocial personality disorder?
It's quite possible. I think so. I really do. I really do believe so. One of the things I can say is that as it relates to cases involving, like, there's a legal justification and a moral justification as it relates to using force, right? And we see these things in the news. Did that also have to shoot that guy or that woman or whatever it may be? And then one of the critical things that help police officers is articulation, how they articulate the facts as they currently understand it, as it relates to the use of force situation. And I'm just being straight blunt with you, or honest with you. It's the idea of, if you cannot articulate why you needed to use force, more than likely you're going to be found guilty. If your articulation doesn't line up with the training, if it doesn't line up with your experience, and if the actions of the suspect don't mesh with how you were trained and the experiences you've been through, it's highly likely you're going to be found guilty. But if you can articulate how this suspect's actions, though, from third-party lens looking at it, did he really have to do that? But if the officer can articulate, according to their training, how this suspect's behaviors aligned with how they're trained to address force, he's going to be found not guilty. And so that's where it becomes legal versus moral justification. And so, when it comes to antisocial disorder, these disorders that I'm speaking about can easily be hidden with proper articulation.
Correct. And that's a scary thing, but it's also reality, and I've seen it quite a bit.
Right.
With that, and there's the only thing sometimes, and this is not to say that there's not good guys in the force or people.
Of course there are, yeah.
Because there are some
Absolutely.
but there's quite a bit of this in my line of work too. A lot of times what separates the guys with the badge or the guys with the gun or corrections or police officers from inmates or prisoners is the fact that you have that uniform.
Yeah, exactly. Really I mean, think about this, Doc. In Baltimore, that big sting that they just, I guess, finished up, where they arrested a ton of these officers for doing a bunch of shady stuff.
That's nothing. It happens all the time. All the time. Do you work with officers now?
I'm in the process. Being I just started my practice, I'm in the process of, in fact, reaching out to different agencies to try to, in fact, work with officers. Again, it's a delicate thing because officers don't like to admit that they have mental health challenges, and I dare not say mental health challenges synonymous with law enforcement. It's wellness, that they have wellness issues, because again, it's the concept of being concerned that it's going to compromise their fitness for duty. Yeah. It's the reason why I remained silent about my burnout and the psychological challenges I was having. But I talk about it in my book, but I remained silent about it because I was concerned that I was going to be labeled unfit for duty. And so I acted as if everything was okay. I wore a big smile. I behaved according to police culture etiquette, and you would have never known that I had these issues had I not said something. And so reaching out to officers, what I've done was I usually do a workshop once a month called Patrolling Your Purpose. And in this workshop, I talk about wellness. I talk about social challenges that police officers face, things that are going on in the news. And I wasn't getting a good turnout physically, people physically showing up because of the distance, whatever it may be here locally. So what I did was I launched a Facebook group titled Patrolling Your Purpose, and I only opened it up exclusively to law enforcement officers so that they can have a safe space to be able to talk about some of the challenges that they see in their profession. And I also provide like resources and tidbits from a clinical approach that would be applicable to what I understand that officers are going through, being that I was a former police officer.
So, going along with that, then, what are some resources that you would suggest for men and women who are engaging in this kind of stuff and they're on the wrong side? I mean, because there's elements of narcissism to this as well,
Sure.
you know, and there's this whole culture to this, and it's like this secret that everybody knows about but nobody really talks about kind of thing. So what are some of the resources that you would suggest?
Well, ultimately, officers have to be proactive about seeking help. The help is available through most agencies, the EAP programs, and I think many departments are going to this peer-to-peer support type of setup where fellow officers are providing support to fellow officers, um, and things of that nature. But in terms of outside help, there's still some concerns about that because again, officers would rather be private and rather share their intimacy with people who understand what they go through.
The broker.
Um, right, right, yeah, there you go, exactly. And but still, there's still some level of concern as well, even with peer to peer and the EAP, because if this gets back to the administration that I'm feeling like this truly, then will they send me, write me up, or sit me down and send me off to get evaluated, whatever it may be. So, one of the things I try to pitch whenever I speak to officers is that my agency is independent of any department. I believe in a strict confidentiality, private pay, and I can help officers get through whatever their challenges are. One of my goals in therapy is to help officers or law enforcement professionals improve the self-awareness needed to manage their careers effectively.
Yes.
That's something that I did not do.
Yeah.
And as a result of my failings in that area, I desire to help other officers not make the same mistake that I did. And that was to remain silent about my psychological challenges, burnout.
Yeah, I can see why you would do that because police officers, correctional officers, again, I'm not referring to
Sure.
them, but I do know that, working in EAP, because I did EAP for corrections as well, a very big game, and if you do turn one of them in, it's, they
Yeah.
often act out violently towards each other, and a lot of people don't know about this undercover world
Yeah.
where they get really gangster on each other. And so for them to get busted or turn on one of, I mean, like, that's a really big deal for them to do that. And it's like, they also have one of the strongest unions, if not the strongest unions in the nation most of the time. So they oftentimes have a lot of backing from that, and it's really hard to go against that or do anything against that. So I really appreciate you coming up here and sharing about your experience. What is the name of your books for people so that they can go and look it up on Amazon and if they want to check it out?
Sure thing. It's called Breaking the Code of Silence, A Cop's Journey to Triumph and Truth. You see
Okay.
that?
Yeah, I
That's
see
what it looks
that.
like. It's on Amazon, and you can also order it from my website at www.selftalkcounseling.com.
Okay.
And again, this book is I dub it a case study of my life and how my trajectory created the conditions that I went through, and I also provide solutions of what can be done to address other officers who may in fact be going through similar things, that are concerned about talking about their burnout because it may question their fitness for duty and lose their job.
Yeah. And I appreciate you coming up here and talking about that. I know that that's probably a very difficult thing to do, to kind of admit that you've made these big mistakes. And there is
Yeah.
a level of vulnerability to that.
Big time.
You know what I'm saying? And talking about it live, or being not live, but being videotaped or whatever. And although you weren't able to go to counseling, you did go through this cathartic process. And I know from working with guys that are like you, even guys and women that are like you, I know that's like a huge thing to do. That's
It
huge
is.
for you.
It is.
And so I definitely appreciate that. I'm definitely gonna pick up the book and check it out because it falls in line with a lot of the men and women of law enforcement and corrections that I work with regularly. And I think I love this interview that we did today. It's very unique. And I really hope that things go well for you and that you can really make an impact in law enforcement. Again, I know that that can be a tough bunch to kind of really get going into the mental health or wellness, as you like to call it. But if there's a
Yeah,
way, if there's a will, maybe there's a way. And I certainly wish you well. And I'm so happy that you're down in Charlotte, which is my hometown. So I
no
think,
doubt.
that, and I have family that's in law enforcement, is or was in law enforcement down there as well. So I'm really wishing you a lot of success with that, and I'm hoping that there's going to be a lot of change and growth. And I'm glad that you had your humbling experience and that you're willing to share that with us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doc. And again, when I talk about breaking the code of silence and a cop's journey to triumph and truth, I'm speaking about my truth. And that's the only way I know to be today. I
Yeah.
no longer desire to live in silence. And if I'm going to sugarcoat it, or I'm going to try to be politically correct so that it sounds good for perception, then I'm not really hitting the mark on what needs to be addressed. So I believe in total transparency.
Yeah.
And some of the things that I talk about in my book, and even when I talk to people about my experience, it is uncomfortable because I'm putting myself in a vulnerable situation.
Yeah.
But I also know that it's necessary because people want the truth. The only people who don't like the truth are those who prefer to believe a lie.
Yeah.
And I no longer subscribe to that concept anymore. And it's all about being transparent.
Good. And I imagine that, even with someone, in my experience in working with someone who has antisocial personality disorder, whether you identify yourself as having that or not, that can be very difficult to do and to work on
Yeah.
change. And, there's growth and that process can be very slow and you have to do it at your own pace. And I still think that, as long as you're involved in law enforcement in some way, there's still going to be code that you got to go through.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that whole thing. But you know what? That's the processing, right? Because I think I think it's the narratives that not only people in disenfranchised or underserved communities live by, but also the narratives associated with what the uniform represents conditions us to, in fact, keep that divide, and that has to be
Yes.
eradicated. It's got
Yeah.
to be removed.
Yes.
It's a
And
barrier.
I also think too, and that's going to be an important lesson for your own children as you pass it down,
Oh yeah.
So we'll stop there, but thank you so much, Kareem, and I'll definitely make sure to put your links and everything on the show notes so people can
Thank you.
connect with you, reach out to you, and much success to you.
Thank you. Please. Thank you, Doc.
Okay, so you just heard Kareem talk about his personal experience, and I think it was so endearing to listen to Kareem talk about that and just how he struggled with law enforcement. And I thought it was also something, it shows a sign of vulnerability for him to be able to open up and share like that and even be willing to explore the possibility that he may have been suffering from a personality disorder. And that's huge for anybody to say that or to ponder that and to come on and talk about that. So huge round of applause for that. I'd love to know what you think about my interview with Kareem. I love it. I'm over the moon about it. But I'd like to know what you think. Of course, always email me at adatewithddarkness@gmail.com. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, all Facebook, all that good stuff. So feel free to let me know about that on those platforms as well, because I love all the feedback that I'm getting from folks. Also, please be sure to like, love, and share the podcast. Let your friends know about it. Let your family know. Friends, foe, coworkers, somebody you think might need it. I love all of that. So I'm looking forward to also joining with you in my group, a Date with Darkness group in the Facebook group. So it's doing really well. People are definitely having a lot of conversations around their experiences in abusive relationships and how they are working to heal. So we'd love to have you. Thank you so much for spending your time and listening to us today. Until next time, be well.